The year was 1884, and the land around Lone Mesa carried a silence so heavy it seemed carved into the redstone itself. Days stretched long over the desert, the kind of days where the sun baked everything into a brittle stillness, and nights crept cold with coyotes calling from far ridges. The mesa rose like an island out of sand and yucca, its cliffs watching over a plain where little dared grow. That was where Luke Ness had built his ranch, and that was where he lived alone, quiet and untouchable, like a man carved out of the same rock. Luke was 33 then, young enough by most reckonings, but his face carried the weight of a man twice his years. He was Apache by blood and bone, though the government in Santa Fe had long tried to pin him down with papers and treaties. His skin was sun-worn, his hair long and dating back, and his dark eyes carried something hollow. The neighbors, who rarely passed by, called him a ghost in his own land. They weren't wrong. Luke had buried his wife and little boy 2 winters before, when the fever swept through the valley. He had sat helpless, as the sickness took them both. His hands strong enough to mend fences and break horses, but powerless against a shadow no rifle or knife could drive away. Since then he spoke little, lived quieter, and kept to his work. The house stood sound, the corral upright, but the man inside was empty stone. On an early spring afternoon, dust rising along the wagon road, a woman appeared at his gate. The air was dry, carrying the smell of moss wet and dust, and the wheels of her small cart creaked with each turn. She held the reins with steady hands, though. The horse was little more than ribs and hide. She sat upright, a woman of about 30, her dark hair tied back beneath a plain bonnet, her face pale from travel, but marked with a quiet strength. Her dress was travel, the hem frayed with miles of dust. She drew the cart to a halt near the weathered sign Luke had nailed to a post weeks before. The words burned into the plank with a branding iron. Read help wanted cooking care for stock. He had put it up not because he believed anyone would answer, but because the house had grown too hollow even for him. The woman stepped down from the cart, boots touching dirt with a firmness that spoke of long roads and longer hardships. She looked up at the house, timbers grayed by wind, a porch that sagged, windows dull with neglect. Yet she didn't turn away. She squared her shoulders and walked toward the porch where Luke stood. He had seen her coming a long mile off, the dust plume announcing her arrival. And now he leaned against the porch post, arms folded, hat pulled low. His gaze was sharp, unreadable, like the desert hawk circling above. "You're the owner?" she asked, her voice even, carrying a hint of weariness from the trail. Luke gave a single nod. "Name's Luke Ness." She hesitated, then said, "I'm Ruby Hale." He saw the sign. His eyes flicked toward the plank nailed to the post, then back to her. "Plenty ride past that sign without stopping." "I didn't ride past," she answered. Silence stretched. The wind pushed at the porch slats, making them groan. Somewhere out in the brush, a grasshopper clicked. Luke finally said, "Start cooking." Ruby lifted her chin. "I do, and I work hard." He studied her, searching for something behind her steady gaze. He saw the exhaustion in her face, the dust clinging to her skirt, and something else, sorrow, pressed deep like his own. "Don't need trouble here," he said flatly. "eBay had enough trouble of my own," she replied, voice quiet but firm. "All I need is honest work." The honesty in that struck him. He looked past her to the cart where a single trunk and a mandolin case lay tied down. Not much of a life packed in there. He thought of his own house, cold stove, empty rooms. He thought of the endless silence that wrapped the place like a shroud. After a long pause, he said, "Kitchen's round back, side rooms empty, pumps by the well." She gave the smallest nod. "That will suit me fine." There was no handshake, no smile, just 2 people standing on opposite sides of a hollow door. Neither had opened in years. Ruby went to fetch her trunk from the cart. Luke watched as she lifted it herself, not waiting for his help, and carried it across the porch with a steady gait. When she passed him, her skirt brushed against his coat for just a second. A small thing, hardly worth noticing. Yet Luke felt it like a spark in dry grass, unexpected and unsettling. Inside, the house was dim. The curtains hung limp with dust. The floor creaked under her boots. Ruby looked around, seeing not just the emptiness, but the bones of a home waiting to be tended. She placed her trunk in the side room, ran a hand over the rough wood of the dresser. Then she returned to the kitchen where the stove stood cold. "Do you have coffee?" she asked. Luke blinked. "Beans in the jar by the shelf." Ruby untied her bonnet, shook the dust from her hair, and set to work without another word. She filled the kettle, measured the beans, and struck a match. Soon, the crackle of flame filled the silence, and the faint smell of coffee rose into the air. Luke stood in the doorway, watching as if he were seeing something long forgotten. It had been years since anyone else moved with such purpose in that kitchen. Years since the house held the sound of work not his own. Ruby did not chatter, did not ask questions. She worked quietly the way one does who knows silence well. Luke found himself leaning on the doorframe longer than he meant to, watching the way her hands moved, steady and sure. When the coffee was ready, she poured 2 cups, set one on the table without asking, and sat opposite him. Luke looked at the cup, then at her. She met his gaze without flinching. It was not friendliness, not yet. It was recognition, the unspoken kind, between 2 people who had lost more than they cared to name. The wind rattled the windows. The mesa stood silent outside. And for the first time in a long while, Luke felt the air in his house shift, just enough to notice. Something had entered Lone Mesa with the stranger named Ruby Hale. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, both knew the silence had changed. The next morning, dawn broke over Lone Mesa with a pale wash of light spilling across the desert. The air was sharp with cold, the kind that settled in the bones before the sun had the chance to soften it. Luke rose early, as he always did, pulling on his boots and stepping out to the corral. A expected silence. A had grown used to hearing nothing but the shuffle of hoofs and the rattle of the wind. But the house behind him was not silent. A faint clatter reached him, metal against wood. The low hiss of fire coaxed him to life. A thrown it, glanced back, and for the first time in years saw smoke curling from the kitchen chimney before he had lit it himself. When he returned inside, the smell struck him. Coffee thick enough to wake the dead, bread warming near the hearth, the faint scent of herbs in a pot. The table, long bare, now held a plate with biscuits laid out on a cloth. Ruby Hale stood at the stove, sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back. She turned when she heard his boots. "You're back early," she said as if he'd been gone all day. Luke's gaze moved from the table to her, suspicion and wonder mixed. "You didn't have to cook." She cut in gently. "I did. A house doesn't breathe without it." He hesitated, then sat. She poured coffee into a cup, slid it across. He took it, lifted it to his lips, and the first taste nearly startled him. Strong, bitter, alive. It had been 2 winters since he'd last sat down to a proper breakfast. His late wife had kept such meals, venison stew, free, bread, roasted beans. Since her passing, Luke had eaten only what kept him standing. Jerked meat, hard biscuits, bitter coffee boiled black. Food was fuel, nothing more. But now, as Ruby placed a plate before him, scrambled eggs, warm bread, a slice of ham left from the smokehouse, something in him stirred. He picked up his fork, slow, almost unsure. Ruby sat opposite, her own plate modest. She did not chatter, did not fill the air with needless words. She simply ate, glancing once at him, as if waiting to see if he would reject the offering. He didn't. He ate every bite. When the bread was gone, he pushed his plate back and let out a slow breath. Ruby smiled faintly, not gloating, just satisfied. "There is more in the pot if you want." Luke shook his head. "It's enough." Silence settled then, but it was a different silence than before. Not the kind that weighed like stone, but the kind that sits easy between 2 people sharing a table. Days began to take on a rhythm. Ruby rose before the sun, set the stove alight, and filled the kitchen with warmth. Luke returned from the corral to the smell of coffee and something simmering. He never asked her to do it, but she never asked his leave. When chores pressed heavy, she stepped outside deeper and tied and set her hands to work without waiting for instruction. She carried water to the troughs, scattered grain for the chickens, even mended a fence post when she found it leaning. Luke watched once, frowning at the sight of her with hammer and nails, but she finished the job neat and sure. "You didn't have to," he said. Ruby wiped her hands on her apron. "Neither did you when you built this place, but you did." A had no answer for that. One evening, after a long day riding the range, Luke returned dusty and worn. A stepped inside and stopped short. The side room where Ruby stayed glowed with lamplight. The door was half open, and he glimpsed her bend over a small trunk, mandolin in her lap. The tune she plucked was simple, a lullaby maybe, but it carried into the hall with a gentleness that wrapped around him. He hadn't heard music in this house since his wife's voice had gone silent. He stood there longer than he meant to, listening, before quietly moving away. The next morning, he left something on the kitchen table, a knife with a carved handle, the work of his own hand years ago. He said nothing about it, but when he came in that evening, he saw Ruby had spit it in the windowsill where the light struck it. She didn't mention it either. So it began these small exchanges. He would leave something, a pouch of dried berries, a carved hairpin, a handful of yucca seeds. She would find a place for them, not hoarding, but honoring. In return, she sometimes left small signs for him. An extra biscuit wrapped in cloth near his saddle. A sprig of mint laid on the windowsill. They spoke little, but the house grew full in quiet ways. One late afternoon, as the sun sank gold over the maya, Luke paused at the fence line. A shadow moved beyond the far ridge. It was the wild Mustang he had seen before, a gray stallion with a man like storm clouds, proud and untouchable. The horse had haunted the land for months, never letting men near, never staying too long in one place. Ruby came to the fence, wiping her hands on her skirt. "He's beautiful," she said, her eyes fixed on the stallion. Luke grunted. "Wild. You can't break a horse like that. It comes and goes as it pleases." Ruby's lips curved in a faint smile. "Maybe it's not meant to be broken. Maybe it just needs someone patient enough to wait." Luke looked at her then, longer than he should have. Something in her words struck deeper than the Mustang. It turned back to the horizon, silent. That night, they ate together again. The lamp burned low, shadows stretching long across the walls. Luke sat with his coffee, Ruby with her sewing. The silence held steady, not sit, but companionable. Finally, Ruby said softly, "I know you didn't plan on me being here, and I know I've stepped in where I wasn't asked." "If it's too much," Luke cut her off, his voice rough. "It's not." She looked up, surprised. He met her eyes across the table, and for the first time, his gaze wasn't guarded. "It's been a long time since this house felt lived in. You've changed that." Ruby said nothing, but her eyes softened. She bent her head to her sewing, and the faint sough at her lips was enough. Outside, the desert night stretched endless. But inside Lone Mesa, two people sat in silence that no longer hollowed them out. It filled. Spring deepened on Lone Mesa. The oak spring here was not soft. The desert did not know how to be gentle. The rains came hard and sudden, riding the wind down from the high ridges. By the middle of May, the sky turned heavy, thunder rolling like drums across the horizon. Luke had seen the signs all afternoon, the way the air thickened, the uneasy silence of the stock. He worked faster at the corral, tying knots tight, securing the feed shed. The mesa could swallow a man whole in a storm, and he meant to see his animals safe before it broke. Ruby had been at the wash line, pinning shirts when the first drops fell. She hurried to pull them down, skirts whipping in the wind, her bonnet tied firm under her chin. Luke called across the yard, voice raised above the gusts. "Leave it. Get inside." But Ruby shook her head, clutching cloth against her chest. "These will be ruined." "Better wet than lost," he shot back. But she was already gathering the rest, determined. The rain came sudden, a curtain slamming from the skyway. Within moments they were drenched. The dirt yard turning to muck beneath their boots. Luke cursed under his breath, ran to the corral where the gate had blown wide. A steer bawled, panic pressing against the rails. Ruby, carrying the last of the laundry under one arm, saw the trouble and without hesitation dropped it, rushing to the gate. Together they heaved against the wood, shoving it back into place. Luke's shoulders strained against the weight while Ruby held the bar steady for him to drive home. Lightning split the ski. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled their teeth, but neither flinched. By the time the gate was secure, both were slick with mud, hair plastered, water running down their faces. Luke turned to her, about to tell her to get back to the house, but she was already moving to the shed where the chickens were flapping in panic. It followed, grabbing a loose shutter, nailing it back against the wall as she gathered the birds into their coop. The storm roared around them. But in that frenzy of work, they moved as one. No orders, no wasted words, just instinct and trust. Finally, when the corrals held and the shed stood firm, Luke caught her arm. "Enough inside now." Ruby, chest heaving, nodded. They ran across the yard together, boots sinking in the mire, clothes heavy with rain. They burst onto the porch, breathless, and collapsed against the door frame, water pooling beneath them. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply leaned there, soaked and panting, staring out at the sheets of rain hammering the land. Ruby pushed wet hair from her face and laughed a small, breathless laugh, as if surprised by it. "Well," she said, "that was a welcome like no other." Luke blinked at her, caught off guard by the sound of laughter in his house again. He shook his head, a half-smile tugging at his mouth before he could stop it. Inside the shed wet layers near the hearth. Ruby busied herself with the fire, coaxing the flames higher, while Luke laid boots by the wall to dry. The storm battered on, but within the kitchen, the warmth grew. Ruby draped her skirts close to the stove, steam racing, and when she caught Luke's eyes on her, she raised her brows. "You'd rather I let the whole place blow down," she teased lightly. He shook his head. "You did good." The words were plain, but Ruby felt their weight. She looked down, hiding her own smile. The storm raged late into the night. Rain pounded the roof. The wind howled, but inside they shared supper by lantern light. Bread warmed over the fire. Beans simmered with sauce holding pork. They ate side by side, too tired to speak much, but the silence was companionable. Afterward, Ruby leaned back in her chair, eyes half lit. "It's strange," she murmured. "How even storms feel less lonely when there is someone else to see them through." Luke glanced at her, the lamplight catching the hollow lines of his face. He thought of nights he'd weathered alone, storms beating down on an empty house. He thought of his wife's voice gone quiet. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes told enough. Ruby seemed to understand. She folded her hands on the table and spoke softly, almost to herself. "Patience isn't always empty. Sometimes it's just waiting." Luke held her gaze across the lamplight, and in that moment, something shifted small but steady, like a door left ajar. In the days that followed, the land bore the storm's mark. The ground was soft, gullies carved deep where water had run wild, but the corral held, the shed stood, and the stock were safe. Luke mended what needed fixing, sawing, Ruby beside him with hammer and nails. They worked in rhythm, as though the storm had forged something stronger than boards and rails. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the mesa, Luke paused to watch Ruby gather the chickens. She moved with calm, steady hands, speaking low to the birds as though they understood. He found himself watching longer than he meant to, and when she looked up, catching his gaze, he didn't look away. She tilted her head. "Something on your mind?" He hesitated. "Used the place feels different." Ruby's lips curved, gentle, but sure. "Places change when you tend them. Same as people." Her words lingered with him long after the light faded. That night, Luke stepped onto the porch alone. The storm had left the air clear, stars sharp against the black sky. From the far ridge, he saw the Mustang again, the gray stallion. Mane tossing in the moonlight. It stood watching the house, not running this time, but still distant. Luke leaned against the rail, staring back. He thought of Ruby's words. Maybe it just needs someone patient enough to wait. For the first time in years, Luke wondered if that horse might not be the only wild thing worth waiting for. Behind him, through the open door, came the faint sound of Ruby humming as she tidied the kitchen. The tune drifted out into the night, soft as the wind in the grass. Luke closed his eyes, and for a heartbeat, the silence of Lone Mesa felt less like a wound and more like a home. The desert heat came early that summer, heavy and relentless. Days burned bright as brass, the kind that made sweat sting the eyes and turned the mesa stones hot enough to blister. Luke worked through it all, mending fence lines, driving cattle to higher ground, where a trickle of water still ran, hauling supplies from Santa Cruz. He spoke little of the strain, but Ruby could see it in his face, the deeper lines at his brow, the slower way he pulled off his boots at night. One evening he returned later than usual, his horse leered, dust thick on his shirt. Ruby had left supper warming on the stove. She looked up from her sewing when he stepped through the door. "You've been gone since before sunrise," she said, rising to pour him coffee. "Didn't stop to eat." He shook his head, lowering himself heavy into the chair. "Too much to be done." Ruby set the cup before him, studying the color in his face. Beneath the tan, his skin looked pale, his lips dry. When he lifted the cup, his hand trembled slightly. "You're worn to the bone," she murmured. "I'll be fine." He forced a swallow of coffee, grimaced as if it burned more than usual. But by the time night settled, it was clear he wasn't fine. A cough racked him low and harsh. And when Ruby touched his forehead as he lay on the bed, he'd seared her palm. "Look," she whispered, fear rising sharp. "You've got a fever," he stirred, eyes half lit, unfocused. "Just tired." "No," she said firmly, heart pounding. "This is more than tired." Ruby sat back, pressing her hands to her knees. The room seemed to spin. She had seen this before. The sweat, the shivers, the burning skin. Her mind flashed back to another bed. Another man's hand hot in hers. Her husband coughing until his chest rattled, eyes pleading as she mixed herbs and piezas as she prayed over his body. Nothing she tried had saved him. She had buried him with dirt under her nails from the very roots she'd gathered, the medicine that failed. That was the day she had walked away from healing, walked away from the title of doctor's wife, from the respect that turned to whispers. She couldn't even save her own. They called her unlucky, cursed, and she had believed them. Now staring down at Luke, sweat beading on his brow, she felt that same terror close in like a fist. Her hands shook. She wanted to flee the room, to let nature take its course. Better not to try than to fail again. But Luke groaned, twisting under the sheets, and the sound pierced through her fear. He was alone in this house, but for her. If she turned away, there would be no one. She rose abruptly, grabbed a basin, filled it with water from the pump. She wrung a cloth and pressed it to his forehead. Her movements sharp, angry at herself for hesitating. "You don't get to leave me, though," she muttered under her breath, as if scolding him or herself. Through the night, Ruby worked. She brewed tea of willow bark, coaxed sips between his lips. She kept the cloth cool, sponged his arms and chest, whispered steady words, though he likely couldn't hear them. Still the fever raged. His body shook with chills, then burned so hot she feared the mattress might smolder beneath him. She sat at his side, fighting memories that rose unbidden. The last breaths of her husband, the stillness after. At dawn, she made her choice. She went out into the breaking light, boots crunching on gravel, and headed toward the dry wash, where she knew the herbs grew. She had sworn never again, but the oath broke beneath the weight of his sickness. She found sage, iro, mint. She gathered with practiced hands, though they trembled. Back at the kitchen table, she chopped, measured, brewed. The smell rose, sharp, and bitter. She poured the mixture into a cup, carried it to his bedside. "Look," she said softly, lifting his head. "You have to drink." His eyes flickered open, gazed but catching hers. "Ruby, drink," she commanded, "steady now." She pressed the cup to his lips, guided the liquid down. It coughed, choked, but swallowed. Afterward, he sank back, breathing ragged. Ruby sat beside him, clutching the cup, her own heart hammering. Hours passed, long and heavy. She kept vigil, head bent in prayer. She barely remembered how to form. Finally, near evening, she felt the heat break. Sweat ran down his temples, but it was the sweat of fever passing. His breathing eased. His body stilled into real sleep. Ruby sagged back in the chair, exhaustion crashing over her. Her hands smelled of sage and mint, her dress stained with sweat and broth. She closed her eyes, resting her head on the bed's edge. It was deep night when Luke woke again. The lantern burned low, casting soft light. He blinked, disoriented, until he felt the weight near his hand. Ruby sat slumped in the chair, head pillowed against her arm on the mattress. She had fallen asleep watching over him, strands of hair loose across her face. Luke stared at her a long time, memory surfacing through the haze of fever, the cool touch of cloth, the bitter taste of herbs, her voice urging him back. His throat was raw, but he whispered hoarsely, "Ruby," she stirred, lifting her head. Her eyes, shadowed with fatigue, found his. "You re awake," she breathed. Relief softened her whole face. He swallowed, voice rough. "You, me." Ruby shook her head. "Don't. I only did what I swore I'd never do again." "What do you mean?" She looked down at her hands, still stained green from herbs. "I was a healer once. My husband, he fell ill. I tried everything. Nothing worked. When he died, I buried my skill with him. I thought if I never touched it again, I wouldn't feel that failure twice." Her voice faltered. She steadied it. "And then you, and I couldn't stand by. I had to try." Luke's gaze held her steady despite the weakness in his body. "If you hadn't, I'd be gone. You didn't fail me, Ruby. You gave me back the breath in my chest." Her eyes filled, though she blinked them clear. "I don't know if I can carry that weight again." He reached, fingers brushing hers where they rested on the quilt. His hand was weak, but his touch firm. "Then don't carry it alone." Ruby froze, his words sinking deeper than the fever had cut. For a long moment, they simply sat, hands joined in the quiet. The storm outside had passed days ago, but in that room, another storm broke, leaving behind something tender, fragile, alive. When dawn came, Luke was stronger. Ruby brewed broth, fed him by the spoon, watched color return to his cheeks. She moved with the calm of someone who had fought her fear, and come out breathing. And Luke, though he said little, kept his eyes on her as if seeing her for the first time. Not just the woman who had walked into his silence, but the one who had chosen to stay, even when it meant facing ghosts of her own. For the first time since his wife's passing, the house did not feel like a place of endings. It felt like a place where healing, slow and uncertain, had begun. By late summer, the land had hardened again under the sun. The storm grasses were brittle, the washes dry as old bones. Luke had recovered his strength. Though Ruby often caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't name, part gratitude, part wonder, part something unspoken. Their days fell into rhythm. She cooked, mended, tended the small garden she had planted by the backstep, rows of beans, a few tomatoes, and near the porch the yucca Luke had once given her as seeds. He worked the stock, rode the range, repaired fences. In the evenings they shared supper, sometimes a word or two, sometimes only silence, but the silence was not empty anymore. And yet beneath that ease, tension simmered. Both carried words unsaid, feelings crouched low like coyotes in the brush. One afternoon, Luke returned from Santa Cruz with a folded letter in his pocket. He laid it on the table without a word. Ruby, drying dishes, raised a brow. "What is it?" He sat, elbows on his knees, gaze fixed on the floorboards. "Notice from the county office. If I can't show a legal heir, they'll review claim to this land. Government doesn't like a man alone, holding acreage." Ruby set the dish aside, drying her hands slow. "But this is yours. Jube worked it, built it." Luke's mouth tightened. "Paper doesn't care about sweat." She eased into the chair across from him. "What will you do?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he looked up, eyes dark as storm clouds. "I don't know." At the words lay heavy between them. Ruby felt something shift inside her. A flicker of fear, not for the land alone, but for what it meant to him. She saw how he saw it, curled, not in anger, but in the kind of helplessness a proud man cannot abide. "Luke," she began, but he shook his head, rising abruptly. "Leave it be," he muttered, and stepped out into the yard. Ruby sat alone at the table, staring at the folded letter. Her throat ached with things she wanted to say but couldn't. That night the Sanchi was heavy again, not companionable but strained. Luke sat long on the porch, staring at the stars while Ruby sewed in the lamplight. Every sound, the creak of the chair, the scratch of thread, seemed loud in the hush. Finally, she set her work aside. She stepped to the doorway, looking at his broad back, silhouetted against the night. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said softly. He didn't turn. "Some burdens aren't meant to be shared." Ruby swallowed. Her voice was steadier than she felt. You're wrong about that. Still, he said nothing. The quiet stretched until she retreated, heart heavy. 2 days later, while gathering herbs in the wash, Ruby heard hoofbeats. She looked up to see the grey Mustang again. Standing on the ridge, mane tossing in the wind. This time it didn't bolt. It stood watching her, ears pricked. For a breath, she felt the strangest kinship, as if the wild creature understood the ache in her chest, the fear of being unwanted. When she told Luke that evening, he listened quietly, then said, "That horse doesn't let anyone near." "Maybe it will," she answered softly. If someone waits long enough, their eyes met across the lamplight, and for a moment, neither looked away. The breaking point came one night in early September. The air was warm, cicadas buzzing in the mows quiet. Supper was over. The dishes washed. Ruby lingered at the table, fingers tracing the grain of the wood. Luke stood by the hearth, arms folded. At last he spoke. A voice low. "When the fever took my wife and boy, I kept telling myself I should have done more. Found better medicine. Found harder. Something." He shook his head. "Truth is, I couldn't save them. And I don't know if I've forgiven myself for that." Ruby's breath caught. She saw in him the mirror of her own guilt. "You know what that feels like," she whispered. "My husband," her throat tightened. But she forced the words. "He died and I was helpless. I told myself if I'd been wiser, faster, braver, maybe he'd still be here. People called me cursed. Maybe I believed it." Luke turned then, meeting her eyes. The rawness in his face startled her. And now Ruby's voice trembled, but held. "Now I sit across from you, alive, because I broke that oath. And I think maybe I'm not cursed after all." Like silence wrapped the room thick and trembling. Luke stepped closer, slow, as if each pace cost him something. When he reached her, he stopped, hands curling at his sides. "I don't want to lose this land," he said. "But more than that, I don't want to lose you." Ruby's eyes filled, tears slipping before she could stop them. She rose, standing close enough to feel his breath. "You won't," she whispered. "Unless you ask me to go." He reached then, calloused hand lifting to touch her cheek, tentative as if she might vanish. She leaned into it, closing her eyes. The kiss was not hurried, not fierce. It was steady, like two weary souls finally laying down burdens side by side. Later, they sat together on the porch bench. The desert night spread wide before them. The air smelled of sage, the stars bright and endless. Luke's arm rested along the back of the bench, Ruby close at his side. Neither spoke for a long time. Words seemed too small for what had been set free. At last, Ruby said, voice quiet. "Whatever paper says about heirs, maybe the land just needed two people willing to tend it together." Luke turned to her, eyes steady. "And maybe I needed someone patient enough to wait." From the ridge came the faint silhouette of the Mustang, standing watch in the moonlight. For the first time, Luke thought it looked less like a ghost, and more like a promise. Autumn came to Lone Mesa with cooler nights, the desert air turning crisp, the stars sharper against the black sky. The long heat of summer gave way to winds that whispered through the yucca and mows quiet. For the first time in years, the change of season felt like promise instead of loss. Luke and Ruby had slipped into a new rhythm, subtle but certain. She still rose early, set the stove alight, filled the house with the smell of bread and coffee. He still rode out to the stock, mended fences, brought back kindling. But now, when he returned, her smile was waiting. Now when she set supper on the table, he reached across to lay his hand over hers. They did not rush to name what they had. It didn't need naming. The land itself seemed to know. One evening, Luke came in from the barn carrying something wrapped in cloth. Ruby was kneading dough, sleeves rolled up, her hair falling loose around her face. He set the bundle on the table. "What's this?" she asked, wiping flour from her hands. "Open it." She unwrapped the cloth and found a necklace carved from bone delicate, shaped into the petals of a desert flower. The smooth polish caught the lamplight. Ruby's breath caught. "Look, it was my mother's design," he said quietly. In our way, it means a bond chosen. Not by blood, not by tribe, but by the heart. Ruby touched the necklace, fingers trembling. Then she lifted her eyes to him, steady and shining. Are you asking me to stay? Luke shook his head. No need to ask. You already have. The silence that followed was soft, filled only with the hiss of the fire. Ruby stepped forward, placed the necklace around her neck. The flower rested against her collarbone like it had always belonged there. Word spread, as word always does. When they rode into Santa Cruz for supplies, folks noticed. Luke Nis, the solitary Apache rancher, now walked beside a woman, Ruby Hale. The widow, who once bore whispers of misfortune. Some looked with curiosity, others with judgment. Ruby felt the eyes, heard the murmurs. But when Luke lifted his hand in greeting to a neighbor, when he introduced her plain and firm, "This is Ruby. She keeps my house and my heart as well." The whispers quieted. At the mercantile, Mrs. Ortega pressed Ruby's hands warmly. The Mesa looks lived in again. It suits you both. Ruby smiled, modest, but sure. For the first time in years, she felt no shadow of shame trailing her. Back at the ranch, the garden Ruby had planted grew strong. The tomatoes reined, beans stretched high, and near the porch, the yucca Luke had once given her burst into bloom white flowers, opening bold against the desert sky. Ruby stood there one morning, apron dusted with flour, watching the blossom sway in the breeze. Luke came up behind her, resting a hand lightly at her waist. "They never bloomed like this," he said. "Maybe they just needed tending," Ruby murmured. He looked at her then, not the flowers. "So did I." Winter settled soft. Nights were long, the fire burning steady. Ruby often sewed by the hearth, while Luke read aloud from old books she'd unpacked from her trunk. He stumbled over some words, frowned at poetry, but his voice filled the house in a way that made it warmer than any flame. Sometimes she would take up her mandolin, play the lullabies she thought she had lost. Luke would sit quiet, eyes closed, as though each note eased away from his chest. The Mustang still roamed the ridges, though some evenings it lingered closer, watching from the fence line. Ruby teased that one day it might walk into the corral of its own accord. Luke only smiled, but the thought no longer seemed impossible. One cold night, as wind rattled the shutters, Luke spoke what had long rested on his heart. "When I buried my wife and boy, I thought the land would bury me too. Thought there was nothing left worth standing for." Ruby set her sewing aside, listening. "But then you came," he continued, voice low. "You brought breath back to this house, to me." He reached for her hand, rough fingers covering hers. "I don't want to call you helper or boarder or anything less than what you are. I want to call you my wife." Ruby's eyes brimmed, her lips trembling into a smile. "Luke Nez," she whispered. "You've already been my husband in all but name." They married in the simplest way. No church bells, no grand gathering. Reverend Ortega came out to the ranch one Sunday, standing under the blooming yucca with a Bible in hand. The old vaquero neighbors bore witness, their children scattering petals in the dust. Ruby wore her best dress, patched but proud, the bone-carved necklace resting at her throat. Luke stood tall beside Cider solemn but with a light in his eyes that no one had seen in years. When the vows were spoken, Luke bent to kiss her, not like a man claiming, but like a man returning home. The Mesa, silent for so long, seemed to breathe. Spring came again. Ruby tended the garden with one hand resting on her swelling belly. Luke built a cradle from cedar, smoothing every joint with care. In the evenings they sat together on the porch, watching the sky blaze with sunset. The Mustang finally came close one dawn, standing calm at the corral. Luke watched it, a slow smile forming. "Looks like even the wild finds a place to belong," he said. Ruby slipped her hand into his, her voice soft. "So did we." And when their child's cry rang out that summer, sharp and alive beneath the endless desert skiwise, Lonely Mesa was no longer a place of silence and ghosts. It was a chosen home, a living home held by two souls who had carried grief, faced fear, and found at last the courage to love again.